The Shanghai International Settlement originated from the 1863 merger of the British and American enclaves in Shanghai, parts of the Qing Empire held extraterritorially under the terms of a series of unequal treaties. The settlements were established following the defeat of the Qing army by the British in the First Opium War. Under the terms of the Treaty of Nanking, the 5 treaty ports including Shanghai were open to foreign merchants, overturning the monopoly then held by the southern port of Guangzhou under the Canton system. The British also established a base on Hong Kong under an extensive lease. American and French involvement followed closely on the heels of the British, and their enclaves were established north and south respectively of the British area. Unlike the colonies of Hong Kong and Vietnam, which were sovereign British territories, the foreign concessions in Shanghai originally remained Chinese sovereign territory. However, during the Small Sword Society uprising of 1853–55, the Qing government gave up sovereignty in the concessions to the foreign powers in exchange of the support to suppress the rebellion. In 1854, the 3 countries created the Shanghai Municipal Council to serve all their interests, but, in 1862, the French concession dropped out of the arrangement. The following year, the British and American settlements formally united to create the Shanghai International Settlement. As more foreign powers entered into treaty relations with China, the nationals also became part of the administration of the settlement, but it always remained a predominantly British affair until the growth of Japan's involvement in the late 1930s. The international settlement came to an abrupt end in December 1941 when Japanese troops stormed in immediately following the attack on Pearl Harbor. In early 1943, new treaties signed by Chiang Kai-shek's Republican government formally ended the extraterritorial privileges of Americans and Britons, although its terms were moot until the recovery of Shanghai following Japan's 1945 surrender. The French later surrendered the privileges in a separate 1946 agreement. History. Arrival of the British, Americans, and Europeans. While Europeans had already shown interest in Shanghai's strategic position as a port, the first settlement in Shanghai for foreigners was the British settlement, which was opened in 1843 under the terms of the Treaty of Nanking following the First Anglo-Chinese Opium War. On the orders of Sir Henry Pottinger, first Governor-General of Hong Kong, Captain George Balfour of the East India Company's Madras Artillery arrived as Britain's first consul in Shanghai on 8 November 1843 aboard the steamer Medusa. The next morning Balfour sent word to the circuit intendant of Shanghai, Gong Mujiu, requesting a meeting, at which he indicated his desire to find a house to live in. Initially Balfour was told no such properties were available, but on leaving the meeting, he received an offer from a pro-British Cantonese named Zhao to rent a large house within the city walls for $400 per annum. Balfour, his interpreter Walter Henry Methurst, surgeon Dr. Hale and Clark A.F. Strachan moved into the luxuriously furnished 52-room house immediately. It served as the consulate during construction of a Western-style building within the official settlement boundaries just to the south of Suzhou Creek. This was completed within a year. This soon became the epicenter of the British settlement. Afterward, both the French and the Americans signed treaties with China that gave the citizens extraterritorial rights similar to those granted to the British. But initially the respective nationals accepted that the foreign settlement came under British consular jurisdiction. The Sino-American Treaty of Wanghia was signed in July 1844 by Chinese Qing government official Qi Ying, the viceroy of Liangguang, who held responsibility for the provinces of Guangdong and Guangxi, and Massachusetts politician Caleb Cushing, who was dispatched with orders to save the Chinese from the condition of being an exclusive monopoly in the hands of England as a consequence of the 1842 Nanking Treaty. Under the Treaty of Wanghia, Americans gained the same rights as those enjoyed by the British in China's treaty ports. It also contained a clause that effectively carved out Shanghai as an extraterritorial zone within Imperial China, though it did not actually give the American government a true legal concession. It was only in 1845 that Britain followed in America's footsteps and signed a land deal to allow Britons to rent land in Shanghai in perpetuity. The American consular presence did not create a problem for the British because it was never intended to have a post in person, since American traders in China were prohibited from engaging in the opium trade. The business transactions were conducted under the auspices of British firms. The only serious incident of political complaint against the Americans was in 1845, when the Stars and Stripes was raised by the acting U.S. consul, Henry G. Walcott, who had just arrived in the city. Neither the British nor the Chinese governor approved of the display. In 1848, France established its own French concession under French consular jurisdiction, squeezed between the British settlement to the north and the Chinese walled city to the south. During the Taiping Rebellion, with the concessions effectively landlocked by both the Manchu government and small sword society rebels, the western residents of the Shanghai International Settlement, known as Shanghailanders, refused to pay taxes to the Chinese government except for land and maritime rates. They also claimed the right to exclude Chinese troops from the concession areas, while the settlement had at first disallowed non-foreigners from living inside its boundaries. A large number of Chinese were allowed to move into the international settlement to escape the Taipings or seek better economic opportunities. Chinese entry was subsequently legalized and continued to grow. Municipal Council. On the 11th of July 1854, a committee of Western businessmen met and held the first annual meeting of the Shanghai Municipal Council, ignoring protests of consular officials, and laid down the land regulations which established the principles of self-government. The aims of this first council were simply to assist in the formation of roads, refuse collection and taxation across the disparate concessions. In 1863, the American concession land fronting the Fuangpu River to the northeast of Suqiao Creek officially joined the British settlement to become the Shanghai International Settlement. The French concession remained independent and the Chinese retained control over the original walled city and the area surrounding the foreign enclaves. This would later result in sometimes absurd administrative outcomes, such as needing 3 driver's licenses to travel through the complete city. By the late 1860s, Shanghai's official governing body had been practically transferred from the individual concessions to the Shanghai Municipal Council. The British consul was the de jure authority in the settlement, but he had no actual power unless the ratepayers agreed. Instead, he and the other consulates deferred to the council. The council had become a practical monopoly over the city's businesses by the mid-1880s. It bought up all the local gas suppliers, electricity producers and water companies. Then, during the 20th century, took control over all non-private rickshaws and the settlement tramways. It also regulated opium sales and prostitution until the banning in 1918 and 1920 respectively. Until the late 1920s, therefore, the SMC and its subsidiaries, including the police, power station, and public works, were British-dominated. Some of the settlement's actions during this period, such as the May 30th movement, in which Chinese Japanese demonstrators were shot by members of the Shanghai Municipal Police, did embarrass and threaten the British Empire's position in China even though they were not carried out by Britain itself. No Chinese residing in the international settlement were permitted to join the council until 1928. Amongst the many members who served on the council, its chairman during the 1920s, Sterling Fessenden, is possibly the most notable. An American, he served as the settlement's main administrator during Shanghai's most turbulent era, and was considered more British than the council's British members. He oversaw many of the major incidents of the decade, including the May 30th movement and the White Terror that came with the Shanghai Massacre of 1927. Through an informal agreement by the 1930s, the British had 5 seats on the council, the Japanese 2 and the Americans and others 2. At the 1936 council election, because of their increasing interests in the settlement, the Japanese nominated 3 candidates. Only 2 were elected, which led to a Japanese protest after 323 uncounted votes were discovered. As a result, the election was declared invalid and a new poll held on April 2021-1936, at which the Japanese nominated only 2 candidates, leaving the structure of the council unchanged. The international settlement was wholly foreign-controlled, with staff of all nationalities, including British, Americans, Danes, Italians and Germans. In reality, the British held the largest number of seats on the council and headed all the municipal departments. The only department not chaired by a Briton was the municipal orchestra, which was controlled by an Italian. The settlement maintained its own fire service, police force, and even possessed its own military reserve in the Shanghai Volunteer Corps. Following some disturbances at the British concession in Hankow in 1927, the defences at Shanghai were augmented by a permanent battalion of the British Army, which was referred to as the Shanghai Defence Force, and a contingent of U.S. Marines. Other armed forces would arrive in Shanghai. The French concession had a defensive force of Annamide troops. The Italians also introduced their own Marines, as did the Japanese. Overall, the international settlement was not a British possession in the sense that Hong Kong and Hawaii were, and was instead ruled as a self-governing treaty port under the terms of the 1842 Treaty of Nanking, supplemented by those of the Treaty of the Bogue signed a year later. Chinese sovereignty still prevailed on the territory, but individuals who were not Chinese and were members of the 14 favored nations enjoyed extraterritoriality. The SMC did, however, exercise a considerable degree of political autonomy over both foreign and Chinese within its borders. Rise of Imperial Japan. In the 19th century, Europeans possessed treaty ports in Japan in the same way they held those in China. However, Japan rapidly developed into a modern nation, and by the turn of the 20th century the Japanese had successfully negotiated with all powers to abrogate all unequal treaties with it. Japan stood alongside the other European powers as part of the Eight-Nation Alliance during the famous 55-day siege of the Foreign Embassy compound in Peking. Japan entered the 20th century as a rising world power, and with its unequal treaties with the European powers now abrogated, it actually joined in, obtaining an unequal treaty with China granting extraterritorial rights under the Treaty of Shimonoseki signed in 1895. In 1915, during the First World War, Japan overtook Britain as the country with the largest number number of foreign residents in Shanghai. In 1914, they sided with Britain and France in the war and conquered all German possessions in China. By the beginning of the 1930s, Japan was swiftly becoming the most powerful national group in Shanghai and accounted for some 80% of all extraterritorial foreigners in China. Much of Hongqiu, which had become an unofficial Japanese settlement, was known as Little Tokyo. In 1931, supposed protection of Japanese colonists from Chinese aggression in Hongqiu was used as a pretext for the Shanghai incident, when Japanese troops invaded Shanghai. For then until the Second Sino-Japanese War, Hongqiu was almost entirely outside of the SMC's hands, with law and protection enforced to varying degrees by the Japanese consular police and Japanese members of the Shanghai Municipal Police. Japanese takeover rest of Shanghai in 1932. There were 1,040,780 Chinese living within the international settlement, with another 400,000 fleeing into the area after the Second Sino-Japanese War broke out in 1937. For the next 5 years, the international settlement and the French concession were surrounded by Japanese occupiers and Chinese revolutionaries, with conflict often spilling into the settlement's borders. In 1941, the Japanese launched an abortive political bid to take over the SMC. During a mass meeting of ratepayers at the settlement race grounds, a Japanese official leaped up and shot William Keswick, then chairman of the council. While Keswick was only wounded, a near riot broke out. Evacuation of British garrison. Britain evacuated its garrisons from mainland Chinese cities, particularly Shanghai, in August 1940. Japanese occupy the international settlement. Anglo-American influence effectively ended after the 8th of December 1941, when the Imperial Japanese Army entered and occupied the British and American-controlled parts of the city in the wake of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The French and Americans surrendered without a shot, while the only British riverboat in Shanghai, HMS Petrel, refused to surrender and was sunk, although nobody was killed. European Shanghai residents were forced to wear armbands to differentiate them, were evicted from their homes, and, just like Chinese citizens, were liable to maltreatment. All were liable for punitive punishments, torture and even death during the period of Japanese occupation. The Japanese sent European and American citizens to be interned at the Lunghua Civilian Assembly Center, a work camp on what was then the outskirts of Shanghai. Survivors of Lunghua were released in August 1945. Amongst all this, Shanghai was notable for a long period as the only place in the world that unconditionally offered refuge for Jews escaping from the Nazis. These refugees often lived in squalid conditions in an area known as the Shanghai Ghetto in Hongqiu. On the 21st of August 1941, the Japanese government closed Hongqiu to Jewish immigration, returned to Chinese rule. In February 1943, the international settlement was de jure returned to the Chinese as part of the British-Chinese Treaty for the Relinquishment of Extraterritorial Rights in China and American-Chinese Treaty for Relinquishment of Extraterritorial Rights in China with the nationalist government of the Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek. However, because Shanghai was under Japanese control, this was unenforceable. In reply, in July 1943, the Japanese retroceded the SMC to the city government of Shanghai, which was then in the hands of the pro-Japanese Wang Jingwei government. Although the original treaty between Britain and China, the Treaty of Nanking, was signed in 1842 on behalf of the entire British Empire, the new Treaty of 1943 was only signed on behalf of the United Kingdom, colonies and British India. It was not signed on behalf of the Dominions. Canada signed its own treaty with China the following year, after the war and the liberation of the city from the Japanese. The Liquidation Commission fifthly met to discuss the remaining details of the handover. By the end of 1945, most Westerners not actively involved in the Chinese Civil War or in Shanghai's remaining foreign businesses had left the city. With the defeat of the Kuomintang in 1949, the city was occupied by communist troops and came under the control of Mayor of Shanghai. The foreign architecture of the international settlement era can still be seen today along the Bundan in many locations around the city. Legal system. The international settlement did not have a unified legal system. The Municipal Council issued land regulations and regulations under this that were binding on all people in the settlement. Other than this, citizens and subjects of powers that had treaties with China that provided for extraterritorial rights were subject to the laws of their own countries, and civil and criminal complaints against them were required to be brought against them to the consular courts under the laws of their own countries. The number of treaty powers had climbed to a maximum of 19 by 1918 but was down to 15 by the 1930s. Great Britain, the United States, Japan, France, Italy, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal, Peru, Mexico, and Switzerland. Germany and Austria-Hungary lost their treaty rights after World War I, and Russia gave up her rights as a matter of political expediency. Belgium was declared by China to have lost her rights in 1927. Furthermore, the Chinese government adamantly refused to grant treaty power status to any of the new nations born in the wake of World War I, such as Austria and Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, the Baltic states and Finland. Chinese citizens and citizens of non-treaty powers were subject to Chinese law. Inside the settlement, cases against them would be brought to the mixed court, a court established in the settlement in the 1870s which existed until 1926. In cases involving foreigners, a foreign assessor, usually a consular officer, would sit with the Chinese magistrate and in many cases acted like a judge. In 1927, a provisional court was established with the sole Chinese judge presiding. In 1930, Chinese special courts were established which had jurisdiction over all non-treaty power individuals and companies in the settlement. Two countries, Britain and the United States, established formal court systems in China to try cases. The British Supreme Court for China and Japan was established in 1865 and located in its own building in the British Consulate compound, and the United States Court for China was established in the U.S. Consulate in 1906. Both courts were occupied by the Japanese on 8 December 1941 and effectively ceased to function from that date. Currency. The currency situation in China generally was very complicated in the 19th century. There was no unified system. Different parts of China operated different systems, and the Spanish pieces of aid that had been coming from Mexico for a few hundred years on Manila galleons were current along the China coast. Until the 1840s, these silver dollar coins were Spanish coins minted mainly in Mexico City, but from the 1840s these gave way to Mexican Republican dollars. In Shanghai, this complexity represented a microcosm of the complicated economy existing elsewhere along the China coast. The Chinese reckoned in weights of silver, which did not necessarily correspond to circulating coins. One important unit was a tile, a measurement of weight with several different definitions. These included customs tails, cotton tails, etc. Shanghai had its own tile, which was very similar in weight to the customs tile and therefore popular for international business. China also had a mixture of coins, including Chinese copper cash coins and Mexican dollars. Paper money was first issued by European and North American colonial banks. European and North American currencies did not officially circulate in the international settlement, except yen in the Japanese district of Little Tokyo, until the year 1873. However, US dollar coins would have reasonably corresponded in size, shape and value to Mexican dollars. Between 1873 and 1900, all silver standard dollars had depreciated to about 50% of the value of the gold standard dollars of the United States and Canada, leading to a rising economic depression. The Chinese themselves officially adopted the dollar unit as the national currency in 1889, and the first Chinese dollar coins, known as yuan, contained an inscription which related the value to an already existing Chinese system of accounts. On the earliest Chinese dollar coins it states the words 7 mace and 2 kandarines. The mace and kandarine were subdivisions of the tile unit of weight. Banknotes tended to be issued in dollars, either worded as such or as yuan. Despite the complications arising from a mixture of Chinese and Spanish coinages, there was one overwhelming unifying factor binding all the systems in use: silver. The Chinese reckoned purely in terms of silver, and value was always compared against a weight of silver. It was the strict adherence of the Chinese to silver that caused China and even the British colonies of Hong Kong and Vietnam to remain on the silver standard after the rest of the world had changed over to the gold standard. When China officially began producing official Republican yuan coins in 1934, they were minted in Shanghai and shipped to Nanking for distribution. Postal Services. Shanghai had developed a postal service as early as the Ming Dynasty, but during the Treaty Port era foreign postal services were organized through the respective consulates. For example, the United States Post Office Department maintained a United States Postal Agency at the Shanghai consulate through which Americans could use the U.S. Post Office to send mail to and from the U.S. mainland and U.S. territories. Starting in 1919, the 16 current regular U.S. stamps were overprinted for use in Shanghai with the city's name, China, and amounts doubled the printed face values. In 1922, texts for 2 of the overprints were changed, thereby completing the Scott catalogue set of K1-18 offices in China. The British originally used British postage stamps overprinted with the local currency amount, but from 1868, the British changed to Hong Kong postage stamps already denominated in dollars. However, in the special case of Shanghai, in the year 1865, the international settlement began to issue its own postage stamps, denominated in the local Shanghai tile unit. The Shanghai Post Office controlled all post within the settlement, but post coming in or going out of the treaty port was required to go through the Chinese Imperial Post Office. In 1922, to the various foreign postal services, the Shanghai Post Office and the Chinese Post Office were all brought together into a single Chinese Post Office, thus extending the 1914 membership of the Chinese Post Office to the Universal Postal Union to Shanghai Post Office. Some other foreign countries refused to fall under this new postal services remit. However, for many years, Japan was notable as sending almost all its mail to Shanghai in diplomatic bags, which could not be opened by postal staff. The General Shanghai Post Office was first located on Beijing Road and moved to the location on Sichuan North Road of the General Post Office building, Shanghai, that is today the Shanghai Post Museum. List of Chairman of the Shanghai Municipal Council: Edward Cunningham, William Shepherd Wetmore, James Lawrence Mann, Christopher Augustus Fearon, William Shepherd Wetmore, William Thorburn, James Lawrence Mann, George Watson Coutts, John Thorne, Robert Reed, Roland Hamilton, William Howard, Henry Turner, Henry William Dent, William Keswick, F.B. Johnson, Edward Cunningham, George Basil Dixwell, John Dent, Robert Inglis Fearon, John Graham Purden, Alfred Adolphus Krauss, J. Hart, Robert Bob W. Little, H. R. Hearn, W. C. Ward, Alexander Mybra, James Johnston Keswick, A. G. Wood, John McGregor, John Graham Purden, John McGregor, James Lidderdale Scott, E. A. Probst, A. R. Burkill, James S. Fearon, Joseph Welch, acting, Frederick Anderson, Edbear Ansgar Hewitt, John Prentice, William George Bain, Frederick Anderson, Cecil Holliday, Henry Keswick, David Landale, Harry de Grey, Edward Charles Pierce, Alfred Brooks Smith, H. G. Sims, Sterling Fessenden, Harry Edward Arnhold, Ernest Brander McNaughton, A. D. Bell, Harry Edward Arnhold, Cornell Franklin, William Johnston, Tony Keswick, John Hellier Little, Katsuo Okazaki. Notable people born in the international settlement: J. G. Ballard, writer; Mary Haley Bell, actress; Edmund H. Fisher, Nobel Prize winner; Jane Scott, Duchess of Buccleuch; Eileen Chang, Chinese writer;